Talent doesn't disappear overnight. It erodes, quietly, play by play, and by the time everyone agrees something is wrong, the damage is already baked in. That's exactly where the Cleveland Browns find themselves right now, watching two of their most promising young weapons absorb hit after hit, while the system around them slowly caves in. Because this isn't just about missed blocks or lost games. This is about how fast a franchise can turn hope into hesitation. Shedeur Sanders steps back for another snap, already bracing for impact. Quinshon Judkins hits the line, knowing the hole might not exist. That kind of anticipation doesn't come from film study, it comes from repetition, and none of it is good. What makes this worse is the silence. No tantrums, no public ultimatums. Judkins didn't throw anyone under the bus. Sanders hasn't complained. They've done everything the right way. And sometimes that's the most alarming sign of all, because when young stars stop reacting and start enduring, something has already gone wrong behind the scenes. And hovering over all of it is leadership. Kevin Stefanski keeps asking for patience, trust the process, look at the tape. But how long does patience make sense when the same breakdowns repeat week after week, snap after snap? At what point does development quietly turn into damage? Because this isn't a slump you shake off with time, it's a pattern, and patterns don't care how talented you are. They only care how long you ignore them. Quinshon Judkins didn't raise his voice, he didn't point fingers, he didn't do what fans often expect frustrated players to do when things fall apart. Instead, he chose his words carefully, calm, measured, almost uncomfortable in how controlled they were. And that's exactly why they landed the way they did. When Judkins spoke, it wasn't about missed effort or lack of talent. It was about structure, about accountability, about how problems keep repeating because no one at the top is forcing real consequences. He never said the offensive line's name directly, but he didn't have to. Everyone watching the tape already knew who he was talking about. That kind of restraint doesn't come from immaturity, it comes from awareness. Judkins understands how narratives work in this league. He knows how fast players get labeled. And yet, even with that caution, what slipped through the cracks was sharp enough to sting. Not emotional frustration, strategic disappointment. The kind that suggests a player sees the bigger picture and doesn't like what it's turning into. What made the moment hit even harder was what didn't follow. No immediate correction, no visible urgency, no shift in tone from the coaching staff. The silence around his comments said as much as the comments themselves. Because when a young star speaks that carefully and the system doesn't respond, it sends a message far louder than any press conference ever could. And that's where tension starts to build, not between teammates, but between players in the structure they're trapped inside. Judkins wasn't calling anyone out, he was calling something out of order. And what came next only made that imbalance harder to ignore. There's a moment you can spot on film when a quarterback stops trusting the pocket. It's subtle. The feet get quicker. The eyes start dropping. The ball comes out early, not because the read is finished, but because survival takes priority. That moment has been happening over and over again to Shedeur Sanders. Snap after snap, pressure arrives before the play can breathe. Not disguised blitzes, not defensive genius, just missed assignments and free rushers cutting through lanes that should never be open. Sanders barely has time to settle, let alone let routes develop. When people point to the stats and say he's struggling, they're missing the context completely. He isn't failing, he's being rushed into impossibility. What's unfolding doesn't look like normal growing pains. It looks like repetition carving bad habits in real time. Sanders isn't going through full progressions because there's rarely a chance to. He's throwing off balance, on the move, with defenders already in his space. And yet, even in that chaos, there are flashes. Tight window throws, quick instincts, plays made in fractions of a second that hint at what this offense could be if the foundation wasn't constantly collapsing. The scary part is how consistent the pattern has become. Early promise, one clean drive, maybe two, then the breakdown starts stacking. Edge pressure screams off untouched, the middle caves, timing evaporates. By the second half, Sanders is no longer running an offense, he's managing damage, snap by snap. And here's the thing, Quarterbacks remember this. Every hit leaves more than a bruise. It leaves an expectation, an internal clock that speeds up not because of discipline, but because of fear of what's coming next. That's how development stalls without anyone noticing, until it's already changed the way a QB plays. And while Sanders keeps getting up, shaking it off, and lining back up, the bigger question starts to loom. If this keeps happening, how long before handling pressure turns into expecting failure? Because what happens next doesn't just impact this season, it reshapes everything that follows. At some point, coincidence runs out. When the same breakdown shows up on different downs against different opponents in different game plans, it stops being bad luck and starts being a pattern. That's where the Browns' offensive line lives right now, locked into mistakes so familiar you can spot them before the ball is even snapped. Linemen stand upright as rushers slip past untouched. Stunts go unrecognized. Assignments vanish mid-play like everyone expected someone else to handle it. This isn't about effort. You can see players trying, but trying doesn't matter when the fundamentals aren't there and the communication never holds. No amount of play-calling creativity survives a front that can't execute the basics. What makes this collapse even damaging is how predictable it's become. Defenses don't need to disguise pressure. They don't need exotic looks. They just test the same weak points and wait. And every week, those weak points cave in on schedule. Once that happens, confidence erodes, not just for the quarterback, but for everyone lined up behind the line of scrimmage.
That's why rotating personnel hasn't changed anything. Swapping names doesn't fix chemistry. Tweaking formations doesn't repair trust. Protection is 5 players acting as one. And right now, this unit looks like 5 individuals hoping for the best. When cohesion disappears, everything downstream suffers: timing, rhythm, and belief. And here's the detail that keeps getting overlooked. When protection fails this consistently, it isn't just a player issue, it's a coaching issue. Schemes are supposed to simplify. Adjustments are supposed to protect weaknesses. But when the same errors repeat uncorrected, it signals something deeper, a system that either can't adapt or refuses to. That's why every hit on Shedeur Sanders and every collision Quinshon Judkins absorbs feels unnecessary. These aren't defenders winning. These are preventable losses happening in plain sight. And the longer this pattern goes untouched, the more dangerous it becomes. Because once an offensive line accepts dysfunction as normal, the damage doesn't stop at the trenches, it spreads. And that leads directly to the one place it should have been stopped first. At a certain point, patience stops being a virtue and starts looking like avoidance. That line is exactly where Kevin Stefanski has been living. Week after week, the message stays the same. Trust the process, evaluate the tape, clean things up. The problem isn't the words themselves, it's the timing. Because while explanations keep coming, urgency never seems to arrive. This isn't about overreacting to one bad performance. The warning signs didn't show up once, they showed up early and kept repeating. Collapsing pockets, missed assignments, free rushers. And yet, the response stayed cautious, almost detached, as if these issues would correct themselves with enough patience. That works for minor problems. It doesn't work for structural ones. What makes this stretch so damaging is the delay. Adjustments in football aren't just about what you change, they're about when you change it. By the time tweaks are considered, damage has already been absorbed, hits have already been taken, confidence has already been chipped away. Patience, in this case, hasn't protected anyone, it's exposed them. There's also the quiet message that sends to the locker room. When the same unit struggles and faces no real consequences, accountability starts to blur. Players notice, not in a dramatic way, but in a slow realization that standards are negotiable. And once that belief sets in, effort alone can't compensate for structure that never corrects itself. Reports and fan speculation suggest frustration hasn't exploded because everyone understands the optics. Young players especially know how quickly criticism can be flipped back on them. So instead of noise, you get endurance. Instead of confrontation, you get silence. But silence doesn't mean acceptance. It means patience is running thin.
Stefanski's approach was meant to stabilize. Instead, it's created a dangerous limbo where problems are acknowledged but never confronted head-on. And the longer that limbo lasts, the harder it becomes to convince anyone that real change is coming.
Because patience only works when progress follows. And right now, progress feels like a promise that keeps getting pushed to next week. This is the part most people don't see on a stat sheet. What constant breakdowns do to young stars isn't always loud or immediate. It's subtle. It shows up in hesitation, in shortened reads, in decisions made half a second sooner than they should be. And once those habits form, they don't just disappear because the situation improves. For Shedeur Sanders, repeated pressure rewires instincts. A quarterback stops trusting that the pocket will hold and starts planning escape routes before the ball is even snapped. Eyes drop faster, mechanics rush, throws lose timing. Not because the talent faded, but because survival becomes the priority. Development turns defensive, and that's one of the hardest things to undo. You can see it in the body language. Sanders on the sideline isn't confused, he's exhausted, mentally running through plays that never had a fair chance to work, processing hits that keep coming whether he makes the right read or not. That kind of wear doesn't just affect Sundays, it follows a quarterback into practice, into preparation, into the way they see the field. And for Quinshon Judkins, the toll hits differently but just as hard. Running backs are built on timing and trust. Trust that the crease will be there. Trust that if they press the hole, the wall in front won't collapse instantly. When that trust disappears, hesitation creeps in. Not because the runner lacks aggression, but because chaos has become expected. Judkins is already making first contact behind the line more often than any young back should. He's forced to turn broken plays into survival drills. Every carry becomes effort over opportunity. That kind of workload wears down confidence just as much as it wears down the body. And over time, even elite burst starts feeling wasted when the design never gives it room to shine. This is how careers quietly bend in the wrong direction. Not from one bad season, but from repeated exposure to dysfunction during the most formative years. Young stars don't just learn playbooks in these moments, they learn what to expect. And when what they're taught is instability, that lesson sticks. And that's the real danger here. Because once players start adjusting downward, lowering expectations just to get through games, the ceiling everyone once dreamed about starts to shrink. And that's not something you fix with a better week or a friendlier matchup. This is where things stop being about schemes and start being about atmosphere. Cultures don't collapse loudly, they drift, slowly, almost politely. And right now, it feels like the Cleveland Browns are drifting into something far more dangerous than a losing streak: acceptance. You can see it in the body language. Missed blocks no longer spark arguments. Blown assignments don't trigger sideline urgency. Players jog back into huddles with the look of people who already know what the next snap is going to look like. That's not composure, that's resignation. And once a team starts expecting things to go wrong, correcting them becomes twice as hard.
What's unsettling is how normalized it's become. Instead of outrage, there's explanation. Instead of correction, there's reassurance. Reports and fan speculation suggest this shift didn't happen overnight. It grew quietly as the same problems lingered without consequences. When failure doesn't cost you anything, it stops feeling urgent. And when urgency dies, culture follows. For young players, this is poison. They're learning what normal looks like at the professional level. Not domination up front, not protection, not trust, but scrambling, compensating, surviving. That environment doesn't just impact performance, it reshapes identity. Players stop thinking about how good they can be and start thinking about how to get through the game intact. Even the messaging reflects it. Phrases like, "we'll clean it up," and "we're close," start to replace decisive action. That kind of language doesn't inspire belief, it buys time. And time is the one thing this roster can't afford to waste, because belief, once lost, is harder to rebuild than any depth chart.
This is how talented teams quietly become brittle, not because they lack players, but because they lose conviction. And when a culture starts treating dysfunction like a phase instead of a threat, the collapse doesn't need a spark. It's already underway. And that leaves the Browns facing a question they haven't openly acknowledged yet. If this is the culture now, how long before the talent starts looking for a way out, or worse, starts shrinking to fit it? Rebuilds don't fail all at once. They fail in quiet stretches like this, when the pieces are in place, but the environment refuses to support them. That's the uncomfortable reality facing the Cleveland Browns right now, because this roster doesn't look empty, it looks mismanaged. Shedeur Sanders and Quinshon Judkins aren't theoretical prospects, they're already showing flashes that franchises spend years chasing. Arm talent under pressure, vision in traffic, playmaking that survives chaos. That's supposed to be the foundation. That's the window, and windows in this league don't stay open long. What makes this moment so dangerous is how easily it can be rationalized away. Close losses, tough matchups, youth, growing pains, all true on the surface, but underneath it sits a harsher truth. Time doesn't pause for potential. Every week that passes without protection, without structural change, is a week where development stalls and confidence leaks out. The scary part is how fast that window can close without a trade or an injury ever happening. Quarterbacks start playing tight, running backs stop trusting schemes, careers bend subtly, then permanently. And by the time a front office realizes it's gone, the narrative is already shifted from building something to what went wrong. There's also the human side that rarely gets acknowledged. Young stars don't just evaluate teams by talent, they feel the environment. They remember who adjusted for them and who asked them to endure. Reports and fan speculation suggest that patience isn't infinite even when players stay professional, because no one wants to be the face of a rebuild that never actually protects its core.
This is the inflection point. The Browns can treat this stretch like a rough chapter, or they can recognize it as a warning, because rebuilds aren't wasted when they lose games. They're wasted when they teach the wrong lessons. And if nothing changes soon, this won't be remembered as the beginning of something promising. It'll be remembered as the moment the Browns had their future in hand and let it slip through. There's no gray area left here, no in-between solution, no quiet fix that solves everything without uncomfortable decisions. The Cleveland Browns have reached the part of the story where doing nothing is a choice, and it's the most damaging one they can make. Shedeur Sanders and Quinshon Judkins have already shown enough to know what they are. They're not the problem. They never were. What's failing them isn't effort, toughness, or maturity. It's protection. It's urgency. It's a system that keeps asking them to absorb consequences for mistakes they didn't create. This is the fork in the road franchises talk about years later. Stick with familiarity and risk normalizing dysfunction, or admit that something at the core is broken and tear it down before it ruins what's left. Those decisions don't show up on highlight reels. They show up in whether a young quarterback trusts the pocket next season, whether a running back still believes lanes will be there when it matters. The most unsettling part is how close this already feels to being irreversible. Confidence is fragile, habits harden fast, and when players stop expecting support from their own system, recovery isn't guaranteed, it's uphill. Development, when mishandled, doesn't pause, it erodes. The Browns still have time, not unlimited time, just enough. Enough to prove this isn't another cautionary tale, enough to show their stars that patience will finally be met with action. Because in this league, talent survives pressure from defenses, but it rarely survives a neglect from within. And now, the choice is unavoidable. Protect the future, or keep pretending it'll survive on its own.